Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our cyber webinar with Kieran Martin, who is the founding CEO of NCSC, and he's now Professor of Practice in the Management of Public Organisations at Oxford University, and a much posher Irish person that I am, or Eamon Keane. So yeah, we're delighted to have you this morning, Kieran, to talk about protecting Scotland against a major incident or major incidents. Over to you.
Well, thanks for that, I think. I'll come back to that in a minute. Thanks for joining. It's really nice to join friends at the SBRC again. I'm a big fan of this organisation, and I'm not just saying that to be polite. I think that over the years that I was in charge of UK cybersecurity, it was a great organisation to deal with, and I think it's going from strength to strength under Jude's leadership. I remember once people asked me at an event in Edinburgh, if you remember those things we used to have, they were called events, and we used to like get together in a room and talk and that sort of thing. I said that what I liked about the SBRC was I thought that it used Scotland's optimal size. It wasn't too small, but wasn't sort of as huge as the London scene, and it had a very good cross-sectoral approach into bringing government, the emergency services and business together, and you could get everybody in a room who would be responsible for dealing with a sort of national crisis at Scotland-wide level. And so I've been very optimistic, and paeans of praise to the SBRC. And as always, when you pay someone a compliment in Scotland, someone brought me right down to earth for saying, yes, of course you can get us all in the same room so you can blame everybody in it. So there we are. But I do think that enduring strength of the SBRC model works, so I'm really pleased to be here. I'm a bit confused about the time and manner of this presentation for reasons I'll come on to. So on the manner of it, well, Jude's just alluded to it, because, mocking my posh accent, as she's been doing on social media, we grew up about less than 30 miles away from each other, although we were never close, on the other side of the Irish Sea. And her accent has survived the best part of somewhere between 2 and 3 decades in Scotland, and mine has in southern England. And so for the first time in many years, she's made me paranoid about my accent. So if you hear some sort of mangled thing, it's not your connection, it's just me. I'm really struggling with it at the minute, because I help out at my 8-year-old son's rugby coach locally, and they're just learning contact, and you have to so I'm trying to recover my native accent, thanks to Jude. But in rugby coaching, when you're teaching contact rugby, for those of you who know this, you have to explain something called the Tower of Power. And if you try and say that in a Tyrone accent, Tower of Power, and so forth, then you end up bringing much opprobrium on yourself. So my accent's all over the place at the minute. And then there's the thing about time, and this is your session, so I won't, please do the Q&A, but Jude sort of indicated that she wanted a relatively sort of detailed presentation, and it reminds me of many years ago, before I was involved in cybersecurity. I was working in the Treasury at the time, around the time of the Iraq War, and the leader of the Treasury and the Chancellor at the time was Gordon Brown. At the point of speaking, Scotland's last Prime Minister. I'm not making a political point, I'm just saying that's a fact. He was telling one of his stock jokes about how in his early days in politics, he had been asked all of a sudden to make what he thought was a relatively lengthy speech, and being quite good with words, he expostulated for 3/4 of an hour. And then he came off, and his chairman said, I only asked you to speak for 4 to 5 minutes, not 45. To which the then permanent secretary, who was my boss at the time, responded with a very brave joke, given that it was around the time of the Iraq War. He said, I thought we'd learn to ignore 45-minute warnings from this government. But there you are. Moving on, I wanted to do 3 things this morning. Firstly, we've got the quite cheery title of responding to major cyber incidents, with a lovely little plural in brackets. So what I thought was, since I've started in all of my 5.5 weeks of academia, one of the things I've started to explore is the gap between the rhetoric and warnings of cybersecurity, many of which are well-meaning, but actually some of them are just to sell stuff. And the gap between the rhetoric on cyber threat and what the reality is. And that's not to downplay the severity of the cyber threat. Why would I do that? It's my living, but I also believe it to be true. But there's no point in defending against a monster that you don't understand. So if I do nothing else, I'd like to just help you understand the sort of things I saw, as opposed to the theory that people write about or the threats that people advertise a solution against. So that's the first thing. The second thing is just, and that'll take up most of it if that's all right. The second thing I wanted to do was do a little bit about what you can do in terms of risk management in advance of a possible crisis to reduce the chances of it happening to you, and to be able to maximize your chances of minimizing the damage if it does happen. And then the third thing was, if something does happen, how do you respond in a crisis? But before I did that, just a brief bit of context. I mean, yeah, I do think that SBRC is a great organization. I did enjoy the slightly gloomy title about preparing for major cyber incidents and so forth. And most events in cybersecurity do have gloomy titles. It kind of goes with the territory. But I wanted to strike a relatively positive note about this topic in two ways. One is, I think, positivity about technology is almost a requirement these days. In 2020, I mean, it's been such a catastrophic year in terms of it's been such a catastrophic year in terms of health of our loved ones, economics. Everybody's got so much to worry about. We struggled. I think we'd all struggled to find a person who has has less to worry about this year than he or she did last year. But actually, when you think about it, technology has been one of the heroes of 2020. The pandemic and lockdown massively increased demand for technology. And firstly, it didn't fall over. You know, we have all these spectacular stats about, 700% increase in Zoom calls and all the rest of it. Increases in demand for online services. And by and large, they didn't fall over. And as well as, the obvious heroes of the pandemic in terms of health workers putting themselves at risk and so forth, the people who fix cabinets in the middle of the night in cold, wet locations and all the rest of it did keep us going. The fact that the telecoms companies did keep their services going is really to be welcomed. But also organizations like the ones who are SBRC members, everybody did something that any leader knows is catastrophically risky. We changed business models in an unplanned way in a matter of a few days, going from 5% home working to 95% home working or whatever it was, unplanned in about 2 days is a very risky thing to do. And by and large, people did it really well. So I think there's something to be positive about in terms of what we've achieved so far in the use of technology during the pandemic, but also I think with so much else to worry about, we shouldn't spread fear unnecessarily about the technology risk, and B, I think we have to find ways of fostering and bolstering confidence in technology because we need it now more than ever. And then the second point I would make in context is that it is a solvable or at least manageable problem. It doesn't have to be solved, it just needs to be managed. But there are plenty of things that every organization here can do to reduce the risk. And the one thing that I'm not asking to do, I'm not asking people who run emergency services, people who run businesses selling whatever it is, food, clothes, I'm not asking you to repurpose your life towards cybersecurity. It's just there's a bunch of things you can do to make your organization good enough to manage cyber risk. So with that, I will start just on my little exposition of the sort of harms I witnessed. My prelude to this was when I first trialed this model out was I was rereading a book by a right-wing American satirist called P.J. O'Rourke, and it's a collection of essays which are all quite funny and deliberately provocative. And my favorite one was called Studying for a Drugs Test. And in Studying for a Drugs Test, it started off with 30 years ago last month, the Reagan administration made this massive announcement, the president himself and the first lady, introducing stringent, random, mandatory drug testing for all sorts of people, every federal government worker and anybody who worked in a sensitive area involving safety or security. And the sort of fundamental sort of headline of this announcement was about commercial aviation. And so anybody involved in the flying of a plane, cabin crew, pilots and so forth, could be randomly drug tested. And P.J. O'Rourke, because he was a sort of libertarian skeptic of government intervention, rang the Federal Aviation Administration in the United States and said, how many people since the Second World War have been killed or seriously injured as a result of an aviation incident where drug use by anybody connected with the flying of the aircraft was involved. And after a sort of sheepish pause, the answer came back, none. And this reminded me a bit of the cybersecurity debate when I came into it in about 2013. Because there clearly was some serious issues in the US. There was a serious problem with drug use. It was causing all sorts of social harm. And there was, you know, while statistically it was relatively small, it was obviously terrifying that planes did crash and people on board had no chance. The problem was the two things were unconnected. And you didn't help either problem by speciously linking the two. Now, you may, you know, no one thinks that allowing pilots to fly whilst taking lots of drugs is a particularly good idea, but it wasn't a major part of the problem. And by focusing public policy action, you know, public policy interventions are finite. You've only got a few of them. You've got limited political attention span, limited political capital, limited legislative time, limited institutional capacity. So do things that matter, that are based on the actual harms that are happening and the causes of those harms. And I thought of that because when I first came into this business and I was asked to give presentations, I was nervous. I didn't do any public speaking in the first 17 years of my civil service career. And all of a sudden had to present to a bunch of young techies at some skills conference. And so my team wrote me a speech and I was going to read it out as prepared. And they said, you know, actually, we're thinking the evidence shows that people like you need to be saying that we need a balanced and nuanced and evidence-based, fact-based approach to understanding this risk. And actually, there is, you know, there are relatively few instances of major cyber catastrophes, but there are all sorts of other harms being done. So I was going to say all of this. Then I walked out, and there was the obligatory video of the conference before I walked out. And I walked out and the stage went dark and then some scary music came on. And then there was a picture, a video of a city in flames with rioters and empty cash machines and everything, all because of a catastrophic cyber attack. So that was my studying for a drugs test moment. It was, you know, here we were, I was out to give a balanced and nuanced account of the cybersecurity threat. And all of a sudden everybody was talking about a cyber apocalypse. You will know, because you would have noticed that there hasn't been a cyber apocalypse. You know, it's 36 years since Matthew Broderick's War Games film implied that you could start a nuclear war by guessing the password of the Pentagon. You know, the Pentagon can be hacked. All networks can be attacked, and defense ministries around the world, including in the UK, have suffered attacks. It is a stretch to launch a nuclear missile by guessing a password from a suburban teenage bedroom. The reality is more complicated than that. So what I plan to do is just take you through a little matrix that I've drawn. If you can see that, can you see that all right? Of the cyber attacks that I have seen in my time in office. And so here are the groups of actual attacks that I saw in my time. So the first set of attacks that I saw are around getting robbed. Cybersecurity has changed the way we interact with each other, but hasn't changed fundamentals of human nature. And funnily enough, where there's money, there has been attacks. And this is the core of an awful lot of the sort of cyber harms that we've seen. And they're in a nice 3x3 matrix, there have been three types of each of them. So I'm getting robbed. Firstly, there's cash theft. Money is held online and people do go and steal it. At the sort of national risk point of view, because I know there'll be banks who are involved in SBRC and similar organizations. The North Koreans went through a phase in around 2017 of actually doing some really quite interesting and very crafty and very sneaky attacks on endpoints of the SWIFT interbank clearance system. And they managed to cash out in casinos in Manila $81 million from the Bank of Bangladesh by doing this. And only a typo in English, which alerted the Federal Reserve in New York, stopped the 81 million from being 850 million, which would have actually been quite a strategically significant amount of money for a financial institution. At the other end, data is actually quite hard to come by, which is a bit weird given the topic that we're talking about. But the National Crime Agency at one point estimated that around £200,000 per day was verifiably being taken from British citizens. That was about a 2018 figure. I suspect it's on the low side. So, I mean, that's just the emptying bank accounts. So there are cyber attacks that just steal cash. There are then cyber attacks that steal IP. And this has been associated for a long time with the Chinese state. We sometimes lazily lump together China and Russia as threat actors. That's because they're the two most competent nation states, but what they're interested in and therefore what they attack are really quite different. And whilst the Russian state-sponsored cyber attacks scheme has been very traditionally political in its motivation, the Chinese has been economic. And so particularly in the noughties, China would steal car designs and then there'd be a knockoff copy at a much cheaper price with indecent speed available in the Chinese market relatively soon afterwards. That sort of thing. And certainly, United States businesses as well as European businesses have been, hit badly by this to the concern of governments. And then the third category is data theft. And this leads you into some really quite difficult and interesting territory. We are losing data. We're losing data hand over fist to cyber criminals. And it's quite hard to understand why and what it's for. But the headline figures are well known. The Equifax was 142 million, et cetera, target and so on. In this country, being subject to the General Data Protection Regulation, there have been sort of marquee cases in British Airways being fined £183 million, a significant increase on the previous statutory maximum of £500,000. The Marriott Hotel Group being fined 99 million. And one of the things I think it's interesting about data theft is why it happens and where it goes, and also the harm that it causes. When you are thinking about cyber harm, I think one of the immaturities of the cyber debate is understanding gradations of data theft. So I'll give you two hypothetical scenarios. In scenario one, 100 million records go, but they are just basic customer records that are quite well segmented. So it's just name, email address, and last 4 digits of a bank card. All you can really do with that is sell it on to other criminals who might be able to match it to other stolen data sets to build together a slightly better data picture for identity fraud. But even though there's 100 million people on the list to notify that you've lost their data, actually they themselves are at relatively little direct harm. Let's take another hypothetical scenario where there's 500,000, but there are detailed things like security clearance forms or mortgage applications, and it's the full data set. And there's actually quite a lot of information about address history, about possibly mother's maiden name and all their secondary identifiers and so forth. Those people are at far more risk, and therefore, in my view, the 500,000 data losses from that scenario are actually more serious than the 100 million basic details in the first scenario. We don't really understand that yet. But data can be monetized, and sometimes, and the more data that exists in a single data set, the easier it is. We then move on, given that we're looking at major national incidents, to getting weakened. And the first bit here is espionage, and I'm going to go back to data theft where it actually causes strategic harm. So to take a case from the United States, in the mid-2010s, the US government went public with the fact that something called the Office of Personnel Management, which is in effect the civil service department for the federal government, had lost 22.1 million personnel security files to the Chinese state. Now, this is a strategic blow to the US and was recognized as such and publicly affirmed by the Obama administration at the time. Because to go back to the point I've just made, having filled in many security clearance forms over my time in government, it is everything, absolutely everything. Where you went to school, all the members of your family, anything interesting about you, all your financial records, all your commitments, your monthly budget, and your list of direct debits. I mean, this is everything. The data set also, it is believed, contained 5.6 million fingerprints. And the data set was everyone who had applied for or got a US federal government job in the first 14 years of this century. And for those people, apart from the strategic harm done by China knowing who was working in the US government and everything about them, for those people it made secondary authentication, i.e. mother's maiden name or in some case fingerprints and so forth, it made that useless for the rest of their life. So that's strategic harm through espionage. Political interference is another way in which nation states, because if getting robbed is about criminal activity, although some nation state activity too, getting weakened tends to be about nation states. Political interference is about just messing with our collective heads by undermining confidence in our political systems through misinformation, through hack and leak, and so on. I think it's a risk we have to be alert to. I think politicians take it very seriously, but we shouldn't confuse intent and impact. So I would play down its impact so far in the UK. For example, given who we're talking to, as someone who dealt in the job before the NCSC with the independence referendum of 2014, and as someone who saw the security aspects of it afterwards, whilst, as the Intelligence and Security Committee report this summer said, there was clearly some Russian interest in the Scottish referendum, I saw no activity that could credibly have seen to have the potential to alter a single vote being cast or counted. So I think we don't want to, as Sir Alex Younger, who's just stepped down as the head of MI6, said, we don't want to do Russia's job for it by bigging up this type of attack, but it is there. And then finally, and given the critical industries on this call, I think is quite interesting to ponder, is something that has got the fancy term of pre-positioning. But basically pre-positioning is just an implant on a sensitive network. You get it all the time in the energy sector. You get it in telcos, you get it in water, and so on. And essentially pre-positioning is, I'm going to put down an implant, I'm not going to do anything with it, but if there are ever times of tension between country X and the UK or country X and Scotland specifically, we have a landing point that we can use to exploit for a disruptive attack. And the key there is to find it, publish the details of it, and the NCSC did a lot of this, publishing data in order to be able for companies to clear it off. So those are the two main categories of getting robbed and getting weakened. Finally, we get on to what I would call getting hurt. When I was doing this model for the first time, and quite lightheartedly talking about the PG O'Rourke essay and studying for a drugs test, it remained the case that, so far to the best of my knowledge, no one had ever been killed directly by a cyber attack. For reasons I will come on to, that may have changed, but I think, sadly, but I think the basic point still holds, that the cyber catastrophe has not really materialized. But there are ways in which we are getting actually hurt in terms of our way of life and our ability to function, and indeed in ways that are putting people at risk. So the first is I want to talk about is the destructive attack aimed at actually, so it's pre-position, it's activated pre-positioning. So you've got the foothold in the network and you decide that you want to use it to basically annoy somebody, disrupt them, cause them some harm, damage, inconvenience, whatever it is. And there are relatively few examples of these deliberately, and they tend to be state-backed. And the reason for that is actually destructive attacks can be quite hard to do effectively. You can be a little bit cyber in a way, you can't be a little bit nuclear, but to do a sophisticated and difficult attack takes time, money, skills, infrastructure. So it tends to be done by nation states. And thankfully for now, nation states, even adversarial ones, tend to act for the most part rationally. And therefore they don't just throw these attacks around. But, for example, in 2007, you saw some attacks on Estonia by Russia, disrupting ATMs and that sort of thing. And in 2015, and it was in the winter, so it was pretty serious, the lights in Kiev went out for between 1 and 6 hours, depending on where you are, for 250,000 Ukrainians, thanks to a Russian attack. So destructive attack is possible. However, the bit of the destructive attack that I want to highlight, because I think this is most important in terms of preparation, is the accidental attack. Something I'll come on to in future work is that whilst it is not helpful to overhype the cyber risk for reasons I've already said, it does help to understand how it works. And whilst therefore I would not subscribe to the view that the next pandemic is a digital virus, I think there are ways in which thinking of computer viruses as viruses is helpful. The term was coined many decades ago. It's not a response to the pandemic, but computer weapons are called viruses for a reason. And one of those reasons is that they do look for things to infect, and they cannot then necessarily be controlled, and particularly if they're badly coded, by their originators. So the two most difficult things I dealt with in all my years at the National Cybersecurity Centre were 2 attacks in the space of 46 days in the summer of 2017, and both of them were destructive and both of them were accidents in terms of how they affected the UK. So the first one was so-called WannaCry, which affected the health service in the NHS computer systems in Scotland and England. That was a North Korean attempt to steal money, going back to the left-hand side of the slide. But it was a badly designed virus. It ran all over the place, and it ended up stopping the platform announcement signs working on German railway stations, which I doubt was a target. And I certainly doubt that trying to extort money out of the British NHS was a serious proposition amongst those who designed the virus. And WannaCry affected more than 100 countries. 46 days later, Russia attacked Ukraine again. This time it was a professional services firm in Ukraine. It ended up disrupting Maersk's shipping giant, but to the tune of $250 million. It also disrupted a chocolate factory in Tasmania. The reason I dwell on the chocolate factory in Tasmania is, I think, is two reasons. One is, I think it's pretty solid proof that it wasn't the target of a Russian attack on Ukrainian business. And secondly, if anybody ever says to me, I don't think I'll be targeted by a cyber attack, so therefore I don't really need to prepare that much, I use the chocolate factory in Tasmania because they weren't targeted by the Russian state, but it did disrupt them. So I think that destructive attack, and particularly the accidental aspect of it, is really quite important to consider at the higher end that we're dealing with here. Then I want to talk about the biggest problem that we face right now, which is ransomware. For those who don't know, ransomware works by encrypting the data and demanding payment for its decryption. In terms of the holy trinity of cybersecurity, of confidentiality, integrity, and availability, ransomware has traditionally threatened availability. You can't use the data, and that's why you have an incentive to pay a ransom. So the obvious solution to that is backups, and having backups that work. Of course, there is then the risk, as ransomware attackers are now doing, that they threaten to release the data, which is a different problem and not a serious one. But to my very last hours at the NCSC, if the phone rang in the middle of the night and said there's something happening and you need to pay attention to it, I would have thought this is a ransomware attack that has disrupted a public service. So I'll give you two examples that I think are quite chilling. One was Redcar in Cleveland in the northeast of England earlier this year, where 135,000 residents lost access to some public services for a period of weeks because of a ransomware attack. And there's some really good work by the local authority, by the police and by the NCSC to get it back, but there were some really hairy moments. And then sadly, I did have to rewrite the paper on categories of harms, because it did say that no one had died as a result of a cyber attack. But two or 3 weeks ago in Dusseldorf, Germany, a woman with a life-threatening condition was in an ambulance on her way to a German hospital. The hospital suffered a ransomware attack. She had to be diverted to another hospital, which was further away, and died en route, which to my knowledge is the first death anywhere that can be directly linked to a cyber attack. And the German police have opened up an investigation into negligent homicide. And I think sadly that vindicates those of us who didn't think that a nation state attack on a city that would lead to all the lights going out and all the ATMs not working, and riots on the streets and so forth, but did think that this ransomware business was getting completely out of control and that it was disrupting services, because, many of these people, some of them rather hypocritically claim in public that they will not attack hospitals and so on. They don't know whether they're attacking a hospital or not sometimes, because computer networks don't always say, hello, I am a hospital, when you're looking at them from an attacker's point of view. I think that the most serious problem in contemporary cybersecurity in organizations like the ones on this call is ransomware disrupting a critical service that people depend on. It may not be a service that puts safety at risk as it is in a hospital, and there's a lot of evidence from the United States academic research that hospitals that suffer ransomware are perform more poorly in terms of health outcomes than those who don't. But it may be a local authority, it may be part of the education system, it may be something we really, really depend on, a critical service of, in policing or other forms of the emergency services, and we really, really, really need to get on top of ransomware. And then finally, on getting hurt with the apostrophe is the catastrophic, because it is a risk. I'm not downplaying it. I'm not saying it won't happen, and we do have to prepare for it. But I think that the reason I set it out like this is that for too long, in the early part of this century, cybersecurity efforts, such as they were all geared towards the catastrophic risk. They were all geared towards thinking of increasingly apocalyptic scenarios, and gearing all the effort around that, ignoring all the harm everywhere else that is more chronic than catastrophic, but no less serious for that, particularly at a time when public confidence in technology is at an absolute premium. I will stop sharing now and just go back and go on to the two further points briefly, so there's time for questions about where all this leads to. I may have fallen into the trap now, having talked for 20 minutes about nothing but harm. I may have fallen into the trap now of casting gloom over the proceedings. So I'll try and lift it back up a bit and talk about the solution to this. And so the second part I want to talk about is the solution of risk management. None of this requires superhuman efforts. None of this requires completely reconfiguring people's approach to business. As I said earlier, it doesn't mean that food retailers have to become complete experts in cybersecurity and so on. You just need to manage business risks. And I thought here are a few bits of guidance in terms of helping you think about that. So one is identifying what you care about most. Total protection of everything is neither possible nor particularly necessary, in my view. So do think about what is your organization and what does it need in terms of the confidentiality of information, the integrity of information, and the availability of it. Some organizations, whilst they wouldn't want to leak information, it's not terribly confidential. It will all be about availability. For other people, medical healthcare records be a great example. Confidentiality as well as availability will really matter. I remember talking to a seminar of the Magic Circle law firms in London. What risks do they face? Well, a lot of them will have, when you're talking to the sort of legal bodies in England, provincial solicitors will have lots of personal data that will be useful for criminals. But in terms of the big firms, a lot of them will have mergers and acquisitions data that will be of interest to the Chinese, but not the Russians. I'm not saying that's because the Russians are nicer. They're just not interested. But if they have half of the Russian oligarchy in their books, and the London exiles from Russia, then they have a different problem on their hands. So just think about that risk. Think about the crown jewels. So that's one point. And the second point is then think about learning the language of your chief information officer and your chief information security officers. And for CIOs and CISOs, thinking about how to translate your work into the top level executive. So one of the things I was proudest of at the National Cybersecurity Centre, and I still would encourage people to use it, is the Board Toolkit. And the questions that any board member should be able to ask the Chief Information Security Officer. So I won't go through all 5 or anything in the interest of time, but it was understanding nuance and complexity that any competent leader should be able to deal with. I always it used to baffle me how people like energy executives who know how to get millions of years fossil fuels out of the ground or the seabed would suddenly say, well, I don't really understand this, or I'm not capable of dealing with cybersecurity risk, when they could get, they could get oil out of the seabed safely and economically with hugely complicated financial and legal and other health and safety risks to manage, but they couldn't manage cyber risk. And the classic you would always explain to them is about the pen test, or the ethical phishing of your own staff. Someone would say, right, we've sent a spoof email to everybody in our organization, and last year the click rate was 50%, and this year it's 10%. Isn't that fantastic progress? To which the answer was maybe, but have you looked at who the 10% are? And if the 10% include your systems administrator, I'd rather have 50% that didn't, because the network, if you own the network administrator, you own the organization. So it's stuff like that. And a culture of people understanding each other, not saying that this question is stupid and so forth, and executives not accepting answers because they're worried about looking stupid. So that is the sort of answer in the risk and the risk management. Then you work out, to move on to my final point about incidents, incidents themselves. And I'm delighted that the SPRC has got the exercise in a box contract to promote it in Scotland. Again, it's one of the things I'm proudest about in the NCSC, and just slightly baffled that the take-up numbers aren't as high as I would have expected them to be. One of the things about exercise in a box, and by the way, I've seen that the NCSC have just signed a contract with the government of Singapore for it, and that's pretty high praise, because the Singaporeans government, they tend to know what they're doing. So if they like it, that's a good measure. So do use it. The thing about exercise in a box, it was partly prompted by the technical people and the incident experts really sort of driving it. One of the personal motivations for me was I was at some function where a very senior banker, non-British, from a major global financial institution, said that the board of this organization had just done an exercise where, and I was being told this in order to impress me, that they'd just taken an away day and they'd modeled an exercise where the whole financial institution was being held to ransom by a teenager for $3 billion or euro or pounds, I will say all that, so as to anonymize it safely. And the whole board was gathered there, and none of its products or services were working in any way. And wasn't this a great thing to be able to model, and what were the lessons from it? And I said, but could you point to me any event in human history that bears any resemblance to that incident? This is not the thing. A teenager hasn't and probably can't take out an entire bank, but there are things, and they're in exercise in a box, there are things that can really, really happen. For more complex organizations, the NCSC was not trying to compete with the private sector, so there are things you can do. There are companies you can pay to do more sophisticated organizations. But I think I would just say that in terms of preparing for and then managing, if you're unfortunate enough for the major incident to happen to you, there are probably three lessons for me. One is, and interestingly, only one is technical. And so the first one is trying to get the capabilities together quickly to give you as best an assessment of the technical impact as you can. What is really going on here? And one of the complexities of cyber, which I think has changed some of the rule books for crisis management, crisis management playbooks tend to be generic. What works in a flood will work in a public, and so on. But one of the things in cyber is that it can take quite a long time to work out what's going on. Even if the public impact is quite visible because your cash machine isn't working or whatever it is. But it can take quite a long time to work out what's going on. And the more technical resource who can explain it to the leadership who aren't technical, the better. But interestingly, the other two are not really technical and they're not really cyber. So the first is communications. One of the reasons the NCSC was set up was because of the TalkTalk hack in 2015, which turned out not to be terribly serious, but people panicked for a weekend because there was no sort of government function, which later became vested in the NCSC, to say, here's who's at risk. Here is what they can do about it. Here's the latest update on the problem. Organizational communications and grip are absolutely critical, and it's not going to be the techie who's out fronting it. Who in the board, who in the organization? Is it the CEO? Is it the chair? Is it somebody else? And what do they know? And how do they get a good technical assessment? How do they make? How do they say things that they don't have to walk back? How do they avoid either understating the severity of it, or indeed, as what happened in TalkTalk, overstating the severity of it in the early days and leading to difficulty there? So public communications and all of this is absolutely vital. But the third point I've left this to last, given The title of the organization that's hosting this event is Resilience. You know, if you can keep going, you buy yourself so much time. And your stakeholders, whether they're paying customers, government, whatever they may be, for the most part, they don't really care that you've been cyber attacked if you're still working, if you're still functioning. They really, really don't. You know, I learned that. I also learned that most people don't care who's attacking them, at least in the early stages. You know, so all these things that we were obsessed about, you know, who's doing the attack and what's the impact and so on. Actually, you know, the impact can be so much reduced if you have resilience and good business continuity. And that's why what the SBRC do is, I'm such a big fan of it. A, because they bring the right community together, but B, they get the fact that actually what really matters is impact, and impact is only partly the result of technical factors. So to conclude, you can manage this. I think we've shown in lockdown that we can manage these risks. We have to manage it. And what I hope I've been able to do today is explain here are the sorts of things that history and hard evidence and lived experience show you might face. We may all face the catastrophic risk, but we can't plan our lives that something apocalyptic might happen. We'll have to deal with it when it comes, but there are all sorts of known risks that we have to deal with. Secondly, there's a bunch of things around good risk management that we can do in advance to reduce the risk of it happening and minimize the impact if it does. And then if it does happen, technical impact, communications, resilience and recovery, and of course, in this context, drawing on that community, the collaborative community that Jude and the team have built, is critical. Thank you for listening.
Wow, thank you very much, Kieran. That was amazing. I actually don't know where to start on all the questions. There's Q&A, there's chat, there's emails, there's tweets coming in. But I will start with an email that we got in yesterday ahead of the session. So early bird and all that. It's from Matthew Schwartz, and he's actually on the webinar as well this morning. So this actually ties in as well with yesterday we launched our instant response collaborative offering with Scottish Government and with Police Scotland as well. So we also have Mark Cunningham-Dickey on the call as well, who's going to be leading that for us. And we've had a few calls actually last week, even before we started as well. But the question from Matthew says, an organization discovers signs that it's been hit by ransomware, but it hasn't been triggered or detonated yet. What are the first steps it should take?
Interesting one. So it's been hit by ransomware, but it hasn't been sort of served notice. I mean, notify all the authorities and call in some expertise to try and get rid of it. I mean, that's the first point. I'm assuming that they still have availability of data. So notify all the authorities, get in some technical experts, and also, I mean, assuming the data is available, if they don't have the right backups, just get it. Get it backed up properly as quickly as possible, because I mean that's quite an unusual case in my experience. I mean, one of the things that I always at the NCSC, there was detected by us or notified to us. There are the two categories of incidents, and ransomware was tended to be notified to us because it was pretty obvious, because things didn't work and you got issued with a ransomware notice. So it is unusual, but if you have that luxury, then get the authorities in, get the expertise in, and make sure your backups work. The third of those is the most important.
Okay, and then the other one around instant response is, what common mistakes that you see organizations make, and how can they prevent them? So we're talking about good practice, but what would be bad practice, and what should people avoid?
Sorry for the dog.
I haven't started yet.
The dog's been on Hansard, by the way, so lockdown best hits. Anyway, most common I mean, the most common errors are not patching. You go back to TalkTalk. It's a vulnerability from the 90s, late 90s, which was still being exploited in 2015. I mean, that's basically the main thing. Not patching and not backing up. And then I think there are other. So not patching and not backing up are the two sort of cardinal errors that you really shouldn't be tolerating. There are other things such as overly complex password policies. Not a great idea, because it just means people circumvent it and they take shortcuts and that sort of thing. simple passwords. I think there's another thing about, and this is getting a bit more complicated, but you can buy in support, and for organizations it often makes sense to buy in support, but you need an intelligent customer function internally. So anomaly detection is the big sort of example of this. Anomaly detection is basically, this is what normal traffic on a network looks like. Oh my god, what the hell's that, sort of, and you can buy in the automated service, but you need to have somebody reading the data who understands it and knows how to do that huge spike, knows how to deal with that huge spike. So you do need to retain some in-house expertise who understands what they're talking about.
Okay, excellent. We have, let's see, I'm going to do Q&A opened up. From Paul Kane from Police Scotland, do you think there should be a narrative to recognise and push cybersecurity as much of an organisational and people issue throughout SMEs and away from the general belief that this is a technical issue?
So absolutely, but I think that needs to be done with care. So a phrase that I don't like in the NCC when I was there banned was people are the weakest link. We used to say it, and we used to say it was a bit like sort of saying that the problem with sports teams are the players. I mean, the internet exists as a human creation for use by humans, so no point in complaining about people. And so I think there is a thing about training and awareness, but there's also a thing about, I always remember, and I use this example in public, I once worked with a cabinet minister who was, an extremely clever, erudite person who once argued a case in court in French and that sort of thing. And when he came into government, we gave him a BlackBerry back in the day, and it was, the security requirements were so onerous and clunky that he couldn't use it. And he was like, oh, I'm really stupid and technophobic. No, he was a highly sophisticated lawyer who could argue and win impossible cases in a foreign language. So it's our fault. We gave him an unusable piece of kit with unusable restrictions and so on. So we need to think about any organization in this day and age that says that punishes somebody for clicking on a bad link doesn't deserve to be taken seriously as a cybersecurity organization, because some of these links are quite sophisticated, and unless you want your even the few in your staff who would understand how to hover over a URL and look for malicious code, do you really want them doing that all day? Because that's what they would be doing. So you got to make sure that organization, in some respects. So I do think the human element of this is really important, but perhaps sort of counter to the zeitgeist of this day and age, I think organizations and governments should be doing as much as we can to take away the problem from individual choice. People don't want to make choices about dodgy emails. They don't want to make choices about passwords, in my experience, and that sort of thing. So take as much of the problem away, make it as easy as possible for human beings to interact safely with technology, and only then start to educate them, etc.
Okay, perfect. This is from Keith McDevitt, who actually said he wasn't going to be able to make this session, so he must have ditched something else to come on today. In a nation of SMEs, is security that is just good enough good enough? If we are to be realistic and get buy-in to managing the cyber risk, and should we say so?
Well, thanks for joining, Keith. Broadly speaking, yes, it is. So I'll give you an example. There is, so if people might remember the Sony attack by the North Korean state in 2014. So Sony made a film called The Interview, I think, and the Kim dynasty in Pyongyang didn't much like it. So they did a very destructive attack on Sony, which caused a lot of damage, but more famously, they sort of leaked George Clooney's embarrassing emails and stuff like that. It is believed that the same group went after a small Northern Ireland documentary maker who were also making some program about North Korea that they didn't like. And I think that, it is not reasonable to ask a small documentary making company in Northern Ireland to be able to take on a nation state. However, it is not acceptable for, a medium-sized company to be susceptible to a ransomware attack because it's just never bothered to back anything up. So, good enough there would be the medium-sized company knows how it would keep going and has good backups and therefore doesn't have to pay, criminals a ransom. But if in a free and open society somebody wants to make a documentary and a nation state doesn't like it and starts threatening it, it's kind of the government's job to help them. So I always thought that whilst generalizations are always incorrect and give rise to anomalies, I always thought that the sort of business of government and cybersecurity breaks down into two broad categories imperfectly. Category one is the stuff that only the nation state, only the government should really be dealing with, hostile threats from nation states, stuff that requires intelligence, intrusive detection that has to be carefully regulated under the law, the sort of things you don't allow antivirus companies to do and stuff like that. And, you get special powers in Parliament and you have judges overseeing it and all that sort of stuff. And you try and work out what, the elite Russian and Chinese groups are up to, what are the latest, top end codes and so on. So that's sort of category one. That's problem one. And then problem two is the whole swathe of commercial, criminal, disruptive attacks on organizations, people stealing money from individuals, from vulnerable individuals, ransomwaring small hairdressing salons, ransomwaring big companies and all the rest of it. And I always thought the aim of public policy should be to create the framework for the second problem. That meant the government had to do as little as possible so it could put expert resources into the first problem, which is only what the government can do. So applying that to a nation of SMEs, it means, good enough would be good enough takes care of a lot of the problem a lot of the time for a lot of the people. And then you have government to help with the rest.
Okay, brilliant. The next question is from the SBRC head of ethical hacking, Declan Doyle, who is he's a tough taskmaster, and he tells you exactly what he thinks of you. And I'm often on the receiving end of it. But he has finished off the question saying, big fan, by the way. I think he means you, not me. So wow. His question is, with regards to exercise in a box, we've already had organizations ask if it is for them, as they are not cyber people. What advice does Kieran have for changing the stigma that cyber is for cyber people?
Well, I admire Declan's constructive ambiguity about who he's a big fan of. But it's nice to sort of see you, Declan, again. It's a good question and it's a hard one. We could try the chocolate factory in Tasmania gambit. That's who it's aimed at. It's just it's some poor soul in a remote island in the South Pacific Ocean, trying to run a very nice business that makes children happy, and they get the Russian state by mistake. And the whole point of IAB is it's not meant to be for technical people. It's you are faced with this stuff. And I think so I sympathize with the question, because there is this sort of I'm just looking at the chat. There is this sort of Rubicon that you have to get people to cross, because people are basically scared of cybersecurity. They just think it's too complicated, and all the hype and all the sort of apocalyptic stuff really hasn't helped. So it's trying to say to them, look, I think two things. One is you manage all sorts of other risks. You manage the risk that one of your employees could run off with the money or all the intellectual property or all the customers and so on. You manage legal risk, you manage the risk that your shop might get flooded or whatever it may be. It's just another risk to manage. And then secondly, you just try and say to them, most organizations have to deal with this in a non-technical way, and this is just a guide to doing it. So it's not a great answer, but see how we get on.
Yeah. Okay. We've got a really great secondary school student, Lewis Binney, who is working really hard to get a career and to finish off his studies as well, to get a career in cybersecurity. And he's been shadowing a few of our meetings and everything as well. So Lewis has a question. He's from St. Kent's Academy, and he's taken some time out of his class as well to join this today. In your opinion, would you say ransomware is the current biggest cyber threat to Scotland and the UK? And if so, do you see this changing anytime soon?
Yes.
There's a lot of questions around ransomware, around people are very angry about it, I'm sure and why are people not really coming out and saying, what do we do about it?
Well, I am trying in my post-government life, and you're welcome to join me. I would encourage people, including Lewis, to go after it. is it the biggest problem? Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the biggest obvious problem. You know, there are other ones that might creep up on us and so on, but you know, it's so obvious and it's happening all the time. Do I see that changing? No, because it's too lucrative and too easy. So you know, other things being equal, do I see it changing? No. I think there are there are all sorts of ideas that are worth exploring. Two that I'm particularly interested in. One is trying to get insurance to work properly. Very interesting article in one of the London papers recently about how insurers are getting queasy about people paying out all the time and just factoring in the cost of doing business. And then the other is about the law. I'm not, you know, there is a lively debate, and I'm not completely convinced that banning ransom payments is the right thing to do. But if you look at, you know, UK law is that if it's a prescribed terrorist organisation, you can't pay. But if it's what we used to call in Northern Ireland the ordinary decent criminal, it's fine. That doesn't really make sense in the US. The US Treasury put out an advisory last week saying if you paid a ransom to an organisation that was on the US sanctions list, you might face further penalties. By implications, if you paid out a ransom to somebody else, it was fine. And none of that makes much, you know, I struggle to work out why it's okay to pay some ransoms but not others. And in the UK's case, it's a result of the law being designed to prevent the payment of ransoms to terrorist groups in kidnappings from in the noughties during, you know, sort of when there were some horrible incidents in places like Mali and Syria and Iraq and that sort of thing. So I think that needs a look. But certainly, you know, one of the frustrations in my last year in government was that there was an awful lot of, you know, attention on stuff like 5G and so on, and rightly so. But, you know, ransomware needs a sustained effort, and that should be a big focus of the cybersecurity community as well. And it's not, doesn't necessarily have to be, or indeed should be, government led. You know, so much that we can need to think about.
Okay, good. So we're just going to have to, I can't get through all of the questions, trying to group them. There's a lot of them around ransomware that just keep on coming in. So I think what we need to do is do another session, so you're not off the hook yet. But there's one person who puts the fear of God, as they say in Ireland, into us every time we do a session, and it's Eamon Keane, because he Zoom bombs. So you can take your camera off now. He's hiding behind Scottish Business Resilience, and he might have some questions. I'm sure he's sitting on his hand there. He hasn't sent in any. So we'll let him have the final word, which we always do. Here he is.
Sorry, thank you, Kieran. Inspiring as always, and I commend you for your vision there. And I think for me, you know, with the detection, we've made quantum grounds in regards to integrating our networks and making organizations aware of the cyber threat. For me, the challenge now is to make something that's scalable, cost effective for SMEs. The regular questions we're getting in regards to instant response. And I think EIB, the Board Toolkit and such things are great instruments for use. Just put your innovative and visionary hat in regards to how can we incorporate something like NIST, COBIT, ITIL, the frameworks aligned to risk to deliver for SMEs across the UK?
I think starting point would be just, so don't gold plate them. You know, I always think that, for example, in banks, I always thought the way that the Bank of England said, look, here's some decent principles for operational resilience, and we're going to apply some cyber specifics to them, is the right way of doing it, rather than inventing a whole new sort of category of cyber stuff. I mean, you know, basically default to, although, as I said, in incident response, some aspects of cybersecurity are different from normal business management. You know, the default is let's just make it a normal bit of risk management and let's just apply the approach. And then, you know, if there's a technical specific add-on, then just explain it and justify it in that way.
Thank you indeed.
Good. We have it was probably covered anyhow earlier on, but we have somebody on from Loch Macrory as well, from half an hour down the road where you're from.
Indeed. Well, my father's from Carrickmore, which is even closer. So
I'm trying to remember his name because he was just there.
I did see Keith's point about not a single Scottish accent.
Yeah, I was going to come on to that. You've been racist, Keith, about the Irish. You want something done. So yeah, Keith, the next time you can come on and you can do the session as well, and you can Zoom bomb like Eamon does and sits there waiting to come in. I can't remember. I can't.
Well, sorry I went on so long. I didn't think there'd be
John,
many questions.
John McDermott from Loch McCrory. So I've got a meeting with him here. He's out to text me as well. I've got a meeting with him tomorrow as well. So yeah, it's good to see all the Irish out today. And next time, Keith, you're on the panel. You can even it out a bit. Thank you very much to everybody who joined today. Sorry I couldn't get through all the questions and comments. Everybody said thanks very much. Good stuff. Malcolm Ward did send in some questions and he just said good stuff, Kieran. So sorry I didn't get through his.
Sorry I went on so long. I didn't realise that there'd be so many questions. There normally aren't.
No, normally I'm begging people for questions at this stage. So yeah, it's really, really good. So we're just going to have to do it again.
I'm very happy to do.
Okay, excellent. And thank you very much, everybody, for joining us today. Thank you. Bye.